When investigators revisit the long story of Madeleine McCann's disappearance, a single figure repeatedly emerges from the shadows. He is not a stranger passing through Praia da Luz, nor a convicted predator later tied to the case, but a man from inside the circle itself. Dr. David Payne, one of the Tapas Seven, a close friend of the McCanns, and a companion on that fateful holiday. The hypothesis that David Payne was directly involved is uncomfortable, but it is built on a series of anomalies and contradictions that demand closer scrutiny. On the afternoon of May 3rd, 2007, the very day Madeleine vanished, Payne stands out because he was the only person outside of her parents who entered apartment 5A. This visit occurred at approximately 6:30 p.m., when, according to his own testimony, he stopped by briefly. Payne later stated that he saw Madeleine, calm and relaxed, a vision he described with surprising vividness. Yet the details of this visit would become one of the most puzzling elements of the case. The problem begins with the contradictions. Gerry McCann, returning from tennis around that same time, reported finding Kate and the children inside, but no David Payne. Kate herself initially gave an account which mentioned nothing about Payne's visit, only acknowledging it later. In an investigation where every minute is dissected, when the initial testimonies of key witnesses fail to align on such a simple point, should this be dismissed as the fog of memory or treated as a significant red flag? Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please let me know where you saw this video. I will read it all and spread it around the world. And don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel to be the first to receive notifications when there are new videos. These uncertainties pale, however, compared with the void later that night, between 9:05 p.m. and 10:00 p.m. lies the so-called deadly gap, the 55 minutes when Madeleine was last seen by her father and when Kate discovered her missing. During that crucial window, no one could definitively verify David Payne's whereabouts. While there is no obligation to account for every minute of one's time, in the context of a child's disappearance, how significant is it when a key individual cannot be placed during the most critical part of the timeline? When later questioned, he offered a highly polished account, one so detailed it struck some observers as rehearsed. This raises a question for investigators. What is the difference between a witness who is clear and precise, and one whose testimony feels unnaturally scripted? Further weight was added by an outside observation from a witness, known as Mrs. C, who recalled seeing a man acting nervously near the McCann's apartment between 9:30 and 10:00 p.m. Physical evidence also circles back to Payne. Specialist cadaver dogs alerted to the scent of decomposition around the sofa in apartment 5A. Critics have suggested that fibers found in the apartment, which did not match the furnishings, resembled material associated with clothing worn by Payne. Though no conclusive laboratory result ever tied him directly, the possibility remains an unsettling thread. Telephone records also revealed that his mobile device fell silent for more than 24 hours surrounding the disappearance, with only one standout record, a 3-minute call he could not remember making. These are circumstantial details: an uncorroborated visit, an unaccounted-for hour, a rehearsed testimony, unexplained fibers, a silent phone. Individually, they may mean nothing, but at what point does an accumulation of such anomalies begin to form a compelling pattern? The hypothesis, then, is stark, that between 6:30 p.m. and 10:00 p.m., David Payne may have played an active role in Madeleine McCann's disappearance. This does not rest on a single piece of definitive proof, but on an accumulation of details which strain the limits of coincidence. The failure to pursue this line of inquiry with vigor remains one of the enduring criticisms of the investigation. If Payne was involved, the truth has been buried under layers of silence. When investigators revisit the case, they often focus on David Payne, yet beside him throughout that holiday was his wife, Dr. Fiona Payne. While David has faced speculation, Fiona has largely escaped public scrutiny, remaining a figure of silence. And in that silence lies another disturbing hypothesis, that Fiona Payne knew what happened to Madeleine and chose to protect her husband. either as a silent witness or an active accomplice. Unlike the McCanns, who gave interviews and organized campaigns, the Paynes retreated from public view. This starkly different approach prompts a difficult question. Is retreating from the spotlight a natural reaction to trauma for a secondary witness, or can silence itself be a strategic choice? Within the so-called Tapas 7, the group of friends who dined together that evening, there was always an assumption of unity. Each member gave statements to the police. Each member tried to reconstruct the night's events, and over time, critics began to describe the Tapas group as bound by a pact of silence. This phrase captured a sense that their testimonies had been carefully aligned. This raises a fundamental question about group testimony. When accounts from a close-knit group align almost perfectly, does it signify a unified, accurate recollection? Or could it suggest a carefully harmonized narrative? Discrepancies existed, but they were smoothed over. The impression was that no one within the Tapas circle was willing to break ranks. If suspicions about David Payne existed within the group, the public never heard them. The circle remained closed. It is in this context that Fiona Payne's role must be examined. Unlike her husband, she was never accused of suspicious behavior. She was, however, present and familiar with the shifting accounts of who was where. She would have known whether her husband truly went into apartment 5A at 6:30 p.m. She would have known whether his absence during the 9:05 to 10:00 p.m. a window was suspicious. As a wife and mother present throughout these events, she was uniquely positioned to corroborate or challenge her husband's account. Her consistent silence, therefore, becomes a piece of evidence in itself, doesn't it? One hypothesis is that Fiona was simply a loyal wife, but another is more troubling, that Fiona not only knew what David had done, but actively participated in concealing it. This theory rests on the way the Tapas group's statements overlapped, sometimes appearing rehearsed. The absence of any serious internal contradiction could be the result of chance or of deliberate coordination. If deliberate, Fiona's presence as David's wife would have been critical. The possibility that Fiona was an accomplice raises uncomfortable questions. If she knew David was involved in Madeleine's disappearance, why did she not speak out? Was it fear or a calculation that aligning with the group was safer than telling the truth? Psychologically, once a group commits to a version of events, the pressure to conform is immense. Could Fiona's silence be explained not just by loyalty to her husband, but by an instinct for self-preservation within the collective story? Consider also the gender dynamics. Kate McCann bore the brunt of public suspicion, while Fiona drew little notice. The intense media focus on Kate McCann was relentless. Is it possible that this very spotlight, by concentrating on one woman, inadvertently created a shadow in which another could remain unscrutinized? The hypothesis that Fiona was a knowing accomplice also explains enduring mysteries. Why did the Tapas group never fracture? One answer is loyalty. Another is that Fiona and others had too much to lose. Her role may have been to reinforce the silence to ensure no cracks appeared. As a mother, her silence carried even greater weight. If she, another parent, expressed no suspicion of David, why should outsiders? There is, of course, no conclusive evidence that Fiona Payne participated in a cover-up. She remains officially a witness. But the hypothesis persists because her silence is too perfect, too consistent, and too convenient. When silence itself becomes the loudest signal, it demands interpretation. The tragedy of Madeleine McCann is compounded by these layers of secrecy. If Fiona Payne indeed knew what happened, she holds a key that could unlock the mystery, yet that key has never been used. This represents one of the most frustrating elements of the case. Without a break in the wall of silence, the truth remains elusive. The hypothesis that Fiona knew the truth and chose to cover for her husband is a logical extension of the lack of evidence. Her presence, her silence, and her alignment with the group's testimony all point to complicity. Fiona Payne may not have caused Madeleine's disappearance, but by shielding her husband and helping maintain the pact of silence, she may have ensured that the world would never know what truly happened that night. In this sense, she is not just a background figure, but a central link in the chain of secrecy, a link without which the silence might have broken long ago. Until that silence is pierced, Fiona remains one of the most important and most overlooked figures in the Madeleine McCann case. 2 years before Madeleine vanished in Praia da Luz, an unsettling episode unfolded during another holiday, this time in Mallorca in 2005. At the center of that story were the same familiar names: David Payne, Gerry McCann, and their close circle of friends. What occurred there was not a crime, but a conversation that left witnesses deeply unsettled, casting a shadow over David Payne's character. The key witnesses were Dr. Caterina Gaspar and her husband Dr. Arul Savio Gaspar, both medical professionals and trusted colleagues of the McCanns and the Paynes. According to Caterina's later testimony, it was during one evening that she observed a conversation between David Payne and Gerry McCann that struck her as profoundly inappropriate. In her statement to police, Caterina described Payne making a comment about Madeleine or young children in general, accompanied by gestures she perceived as suggestive, causing her immediate alarm. This account hinges on interpretation, a look, a gesture, a turn of phrase. In an investigation, how much weight can be given to a witness's subjective feeling of unease, even when that witness is a trained professional observer? Arul Gaspar supported his wife's account, confirming the exchange left him uneasy. For Caterina, the effect was lasting. She later told police, "From that moment, I never again allowed my daughter to be alone in Payne's presence." For a parent, this is a profound statement, reflecting an instinct to protect. Does such a reaction, born from a direct observation, carry a different kind of evidentiary weight than a simple recollection of events? The credibility of the Gaspars is what makes their testimony so powerful. They were friends and respected doctors who came forward out of a sense of moral responsibility. Yet the most troubling element is not only the content of their statements, but the timing of their arrival. Madeleine disappeared on May 3, 2007. The Gaspars provided their statements to Leicestershire police on May 16, just 2 weeks later, but those statements did not reach Portuguese investigators until October, 5 months later. By then, Gonçalo Amaral, the original lead investigator, had been removed from the case. This 5-month gap is a critical failure in the chain of information. The central question is not whether it happened, but why. Was it a case of inexcusable bureaucratic incompetence, or does it suggest a deliberate filtering of information? Had Amaral's team received the statements in May, Payne might have been interrogated more aggressively. The delay meant the most direct warning about Payne was neutralized by timing. How might the entire direction of the early investigation have changed if the lead investigator had known, within days, that a member of the McCann's own circle had previously raised safeguarding concerns? Supporters of the police argue that bureaucratic delays are common. Yet, the incompetence argument struggles to explain why such an urgent lead could be left to languish for nearly half a year. The broader implication is unsettling. If David Payne was shielded from early scrutiny, it meant investigators lost the chance to test his story when memories were fresh. The testimonies from Mallorca remain controversial. Defenders of Payne insist that gestures can be misinterpreted and jokes taken out of context. This leaves us with a dilemma. Do we trust the clear, first-hand warnings of respected colleagues, or do we dismiss them for lacking the corroboration that the delay itself may have prevented? Yet the gravity of Caterina's statement, her refusal to leave her daughter alone with Payne, cannot be easily dismissed. A parent's instinct is powerful, and hers was one of fear. Even now, the Mallorca testimonies cast a long shadow, reinforcing the suspicion that those around David Payne may have chosen to protect him rather than confront the truth. For every unanswered question about May 3, 2007, there is an echo from Mallorca in 2005, a reminder that red flags had been raised long before Madeleine disappeared. The Gaspar's words offer a glimpse of behavior that two witnesses found deeply inappropriate and highlight the possibility that a central figure of the Praia da Luz holiday had already shown signs that should have demanded attention. This delay in sharing the Gaspar's statements is a critical point. Whether it was incompetence or protection, the result was the same. The truth was postponed. But what does it say about an investigation when such a significant warning is not acted upon immediately? In any criminal investigation, time is critical. In the Madeleine McCann case, the reconstruction of the timeline has always been fraught with inconsistencies, and at the center of many of them stands David Payne. His movements on May 3rd seem to vanish at the very moments that mattered most. The first major inconsistency comes at approximately 6:30 p.m. Payne has always claimed he visited apartment 5A then to check in on Kate McCann and the children. According to his version, he entered briefly, spoke with Kate, and saw Madeleine. The problem is that this story does not align neatly with what the McCanns themselves reported. Gerry testified that he arrived back at the apartment around the same time and made no mention of Payne being present. Kate, in her earlier statements, also made no reference to Payne's visit, only acknowledging it later. This presents a fundamental contradiction. If Payne was there, why did both McCanns initially fail to mention it? Conversely, if he wasn't, what motive would he have for inserting himself into the apartment at a time when Madeleine was last known to be safe? The contradictions create doubt not only about Payne's honesty, but about the reliability of the group's entire reconstruction. The second, more troubling gap comes later, between 9:05 p.m. and 10 o'clock p.m., the deadly hour. At 9:05, Gerry McCann reported that all was well with his children. At around 10 o'clock p.m., Kate discovered Madeleine missing. In that 55-minute window, every second was crucial. Yet, when it comes to David Payne, there is a vacuum. In that critical time frame, David Payne's movements are unaccounted for. While no one can be expected to recall every minute, when a child vanishes, does the absence of a verifiable alibi for a key witness become, in itself, a form of evidence? Payne himself provided an account, but many found it suspiciously detailed, as though rehearsed. This raises a difficult question. How do we distinguish between the clear memory of a careful individual and the well-rehearsed script of someone with something to hide? The absence of independent witnesses makes the question impossible to answer definitively. What is clear is that Payne's whereabouts in that crucial hour remain undocumented. When investigators compared the timelines of all the Tapas group members, these gaps became more glaring. Each friend could more or less account for their movements, with overlaps where one member saw another, confirming their presence. Yet Payne repeatedly slipped through those nets of corroboration. This is why his timeline is often called the loose thread of the case. But why, in an investigation of this magnitude, would such a significant inconsistency in a key witness's account not be pulled until it unraveled? Investigators, whether through lack of evidence or will, never did. Instead, Payne's account was allowed to stand, and the inconsistencies were absorbed into the background noise. The implications are profound. If Payne was in apartment 5A at 6:30 p.m., he may have been the last person outside the McCann family to see Madeleine alive. If he was absent between 9:05 and 10 o'clock p.m., he cannot be excluded from involvement. Some argue his inconsistencies could have been innocent. Memory under stress is unreliable. These are plausible explanations for any single discrepancy. But when multiple inconsistencies all center on one individual, at what point does the innocent memory lapse theory become strained by the sheer weight of coincidence? The tragedy of the timeline is that it was never resolved. As a result, Payne's movements remain one of the lingering mysteries. Until that thread is pulled, the possibility will remain that the truth lies hidden not in distant theories of strangers, but in the unexplored gaps of a friend's story. In every criminal case, physical evidence is considered the most reliable witness. Human memory falters, but blood, Fibers and scent traces tell a story that cannot be easily altered. In the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, the most haunting physical clues were discovered inside the family's own holiday apartment. At the center of those clues lay a sofa, a piece of furniture that became a critical focus when British cadaver and blood detection dogs were brought into Praia da Luz months after the disappearance. Their reactions shocked investigators. In the lounge area near the sofa, both dogs gave strong alerts. The cadaver dog signaled the scent of human decomposition, while the blood detection dog indicated traces of blood. These highly trained dogs with proven track records signaled that the scent of death and blood had been present in that room. While not conclusive proof in a court of law, how can such a strong forensic indicator be reconciled with the narrative of a simple abduction? Investigators removed the sofa for examination. The discovery of these alerts sparked intense speculation. Why would there be traces of blood and a scent consistent with decomposition in the living space? The forensic analysis deepened the mystery. Among the materials collected were fibers that did not match the upholstery of the sofa, nor did they correspond with any furnishings inside apartment 5A. This raises a crucial forensic question. If there was no struggle and no incident inside the apartment, where did these external materials and the scents the dogs detected come from? Some observers noted that the fibers seemed consistent with clothing material. In whispers that grew louder with time, it was suggested that they bore a resemblance to clothing David Payne had been seen wearing during the holiday. If true, this would be an extraordinary connection, fibers near the sofa, where cadaver and blood dogs had alerted, that could potentially be linked to Payne. While laboratory results did not produce a definitive DNA match, the presence of out-of-place fibers remained highly suspicious. How significant is a circumstantial link like this when it corroborates other forensic indicators? When questioned, Payne denied any connection, but to investigators, his demeanor raised eyebrows. He appeared anxious and evasive. While body language is not conclusive proof, how much weight should investigators give to such a notable shift in demeanor when a key individual is questioned about physical evidence? The critical issue is the context. These fibers were found in the exact area where both cadaver and blood dogs signaled. That combination of a physical trace linked to clothing plus biological alerts suggesting blood and decomposition is profoundly suspicious. Yet strangely, this avenue of inquiry was never pursued to its logical conclusion. This leads to the critical question: why would investigators not aggressively pursue physical evidence found inside the very apartment from which a child had disappeared? One explanation is scientific caution. Courts require absolute certainty, and fibers without DNA are weak evidence. Another, however, is less benign, that pressing the evidence too far would have pointed suspicion inward toward members of the Tapas group, and possibly toward Payne himself. This presents two starkly different interpretations. Was it a pragmatic decision based on the high bar for courtroom evidence, or was it a choice to avoid a socially explosive outcome that would implicate one of the friends? The result was a kind of paralysis. Investigators documented the alerts and the fibers, but they did not push further. To this day, it remains one of the great mysteries of the case why physical clues of such potential significance were effectively ignored. For critics, the answer is clear. The sofa and the fibers were not pursued, because doing so would have threatened to unravel the collective story told by the Tapas group. It would have introduced the possibility that the disappearance was not the result of an external abduction, but of something that happened inside apartment 5A. The overlooked fibers are symbolic of the larger problem in the investigation. They represent a moment when the trail pointed inward, but was redirected outward, showing how physical evidence can be allowed to fade under the weight of institutional pressures. They remind us that sometimes the truth is not buried for a lack of clues, but for a lack of will to confront where those clues lead. For those who believe David Payne was directly involved in Madeleine's disappearance, the sofa evidence is one of the strongest pieces of circumstantial support. It ties together physical traces, biological alerts, and behavioral anomalies, and it underscores the suspicion that something happened inside apartment 5A that night. Something far darker than the story of a stranger slipping through a window. The sofa and the strange fibers remain part of the enduring enigma of the Madeleine McCann case, a chapter that could have changed the course of the investigation, but instead became another unanswered question. Until that evidence is revisited, the mystery of what happened in apartment 5A will remain incomplete. In the investigation into Madeleine McCann's disappearance, the question of communication has always loomed large. Phone records provide a silent witness, a map of activity that can confirm alibis or expose contradictions. In David Payne's case, however, those records raise more questions than they answer. For the 24 hours surrounding Madeleine's disappearance, his mobile phone activity is virtually non-existent. In fact, only one call stands out, a 3-minute conversation on the afternoon of May 3rd, close to the McCann's apartment. When asked about it, Payne insisted he could not remember who he had called or why. A single forgotten call might seem trivial, but when a child disappears hours later, does a 3-minute conversation near the scene, which the caller claims to have no memory of, cease to be trivial and become a significant point of inquiry? The problem is that this call exists in near isolation. For an entire day before and after Madeleine vanished, his phone shows no other meaningful activity. No texts, no calls, just silence. This is deeply unusual. In 2007, members of the Tapas group used their phones with a regularity consistent with a group holiday. This lack of communication is a stark anomaly. In an era of constant connectivity, especially during a social holiday, what is more likely? That an individual coincidentally chose not to use their phone during the most critical 24-hour period of a crisis, or that the silence itself is a form of concealment. The 3-minute call then becomes the focal point. To skeptics, Payne's explanation strains credibility. A 3-minute call is a sustained exchange, long enough to convey information or make arrangements. Is it plausible that the memory of such a call would vanish completely? Or does a claim of amnesia in such a context suggest evasion? Communication records are often the most reliable way to confirm or contradict testimony. If Payne had been where he claimed, doing what he described, phone records could have helped verify it. Instead, his silence leaves only his word, already clouded by contradictions. The innocent explanation is coincidence. Perhaps Payne simply did not need to use his phone, yet this theory struggles. Other members of the Tapas group had records of ordinary communication. Payne did not. When compared to the regular phone activity of every other member of the group, does this explanation hold up to scrutiny? The second explanation is simple forgetfulness. But again, context matters. In the days after Madeleine disappeared, every friend was asked to recall their actions in painstaking detail. How plausible is it that one of the only phone calls made on the critical day would be completely forgotten? Does this suggest a simple memory lapse or a deliberate evasion? The third explanation is more troubling, that Payne's silence was not natural but intentional, an effort to prevent leaving a trail of evidence. In this reading, the 3-minute call becomes even more significant. It may have been the only necessary communication, after which he deliberately went silent. This leads to a core investigative principle. A lack of communication at a crucial time is rarely random. Does Payne's 24-hour digital silence, combined with his contradictory timeline, fit a pattern of someone attempting to conceal their movements? Reports note that he appeared uneasy and evasive when questioned about the call. This avoidance prevented investigators from confirming who he spoke to, leaving only the record of the call's existence. The silent phone becomes part of a larger mosaic, suggesting not only gaps in memory, but gaps in truth. Yet, despite its significance, this anomaly was never fully investigated. Like other leads that pointed inward toward the holiday group, this one was noted and then allowed to fade. Why, in a case of this magnitude, would such a clear digital anomaly not be pursued to its absolute conclusion? Critics argue this reflects a broader reluctance to confront uncomfortable possibilities within the Tapas group. The silence of the phone, like the silence of the friends, became part of the larger pact that has frustrated investigators for years. In conclusion, the mysterious 3-minute call and the 24 hours of phone silence remain some of the most puzzling elements of the Madeleine McCann case. Was it an innocent coincidence, forgetfulness, or a calculated effort to erase a digital trail? What is certain is that in a case defined by unanswered questions, the quiet of David Payne's phone speaks volumes. Until that silence is explained, the possibility will linger that it hides the truth of what happened to Madeleine on that tragic night. In any high-profile criminal investigation, especially one as globally scrutinized as the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, public attention tends to gravitate toward the central figures. Kate and Gerry McCann became household names, not only because they were Madeleine's parents, but because the media, the police, and the public dissected their every move. They were criticized for dining with friends while leaving their children asleep, examined for their body language in press conferences, and even named arguidos, formal suspects, by Portuguese police at one stage. Whether fairly or unfairly, their lives became an open book. By contrast, David Payne, one of the closest friends present, seemed to glide past the storm. Despite troubling testimonies about his behavior, inconsistencies in his timeline, and unexplained phone and forensic anomalies, Payne occupied a peculiar position, near the center of events, yet somehow invisible to widespread suspicion. It was as if a protective barrier surrounded him. One striking example comes from Yvonne Martin, a UK social services professional who travelled to Praia da Luz to offer assistance. Upon seeing David Payne, she reportedly felt she had encountered him in connection with another child protection case. When she offered her professional help, she stated that Payne intervened and discouraged her. When a trained safeguarding professional raises such a concern and is then prevented from contributing, should this not trigger the most urgent of investigative alarms? Yet her concerns, like the Gaspar's statements, seem to dissolve into bureaucratic inertia. Observers coined the phrase "silent alliance" to describe the Tapa Seven. They seem bound by an unspoken agreement never to contradict each other in ways that would unravel their collective credibility. This unity may have been driven by fear, but it also had the effect of shielding one another. Within that protective silence, Payne's inconsistencies were absorbed. The media, too, played its part, focusing overwhelmingly on the McCanns, while references to Payne were rare and peripheral. This raises a difficult question about narrative. Once investigators and the media establish a central storyline, how difficult does it become to pivot and examine other figures, even when evidence points in their direction? Law enforcement mirrored this silence. Both Portuguese police and the later British investigation, Operation Grange, directed attention elsewhere, first to the McCanns, then to an external suspect, Christian Bruckner. Officially, this may be explained by evidentiary thresholds. Critics, however, argue the reluctance itself became a form of protection. So, is this pattern mere coincidence or evidence of a web of protection? Defenders of the investigation argue that Payne was simply not a viable suspect, shielded not by conspiracy, but by an absence of hard evidence. Yet one or two inconsistencies can be attributed to coincidence. When a pattern of delayed testimonies, ignored warnings, and investigatory inertia consistently benefits one individual, at what point does coincidence begin to look like a systemic web of protection, whether conscious or not? In recent years, the focus shifted to Christian Bruckner, a convicted German offender. For years, his name dominated headlines. Yet despite this, prosecutors conceded they did not have enough evidence to bring charges. The Bruckner chapter is revealing not only for what it suggested about him, but for what it obscured about others. While the world debated Bruckner's involvement, David Payne's name was almost entirely absent. The focus on an outsider diverted attention from those within the group whose behaviors had raised serious questions from the very beginning. The case against Bruckner faltered. Why did this not trigger an immediate re-examination of the original, unresolved anomalies surrounding a witness who was actually present that night? Payne's name was tied to unsettling testimonies from Mallorca. His timeline contained contradictions. His phone records showed an unusual silence. Forensic dogs alerted near a sofa where fibers rumored to resemble his clothing were found. A social worker believed she recognized him from a prior child protection case. These were not trivial coincidences, yet he was gradually pushed into the background. Some argue this was the natural evolution of an investigation. Bruckner presented an appealing narrative of an external predator, easier to accept than the idea that the danger came from within the circle. But others see a troubling pattern. By placing so much emphasis on Bruckner, authorities may have reinforced the pact of silence that appeared to shield the Tapas group. The result is that today, many associate Madeleine's disappearance with Bruckner, while Payne's name has faded despite being tied to multiple red flags. The irony is unavoidable. Bruckner became the central character, while Payne, who was present in the McCann's circle of friends, became a footnote. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann is a study in contradictions and silence. 17 years on, the world still does not know what happened. Crucial anomalies tied to David and Fiona Payne were never fully pursued. David Payne placed himself inside apartment 5A at 6:30 p.m., yet his presence was contradicted. In the window in which Madeleine vanished, no one could verify where he was. Dogs alerted to blood and decomposition. His phone fell silent. Fiona stood at his side, never breaking the pact of silence that seemed to bind the Tapas group. Collectively, these anomalies paint a troubling picture. What lesson can we take from this? First, that silence is not an absence of evidence, it is a choice. When institutions delay and witnesses refuse to speak, who ultimately benefits from that concealment? Second is the danger of selective scrutiny. Justice requires consistency, the willingness to follow evidence wherever it leads, even if it points inward. Finally, Madeleine's story teaches us that truth is fragile. Her disappearance is more than a mystery. It is a warning of what happens when silence protects the wrong people, when investigators stop pulling at threads that don't fit, and when the truth is allowed to slip away into the shadows. Thanks for watching. How do you feel about these arguments and theories? Does it give you a different perspective on the case? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive the latest notifications.